Okay, welcome back, everyone. This is going to be Unit 7, Lecture 27 on governance, networks, and intergovernmental systems. So, we're going to be continuing to talk about implementation. All right, so a lot of this has to do with sort of globalization, privatization, reduction of government functions, etc. Um, we know that sort of intergovernmentalization, as they call it, is rising, right? And this has been rising arguably since 1970s ish, but it really hit the ground running in around 1980 when Thatcher and Reagan sort of hit the scene. And so they define intergovernmentalization as grant, regulatory, and related vehicles of connecting central and subnational governments, right? And so a lot of this touches on the U.S. federal system because there's so much responsibility sharing and so many different institutions at different levels touching on all of these big issues from poverty to crime to housing, environmentalism, whatever it might be, right? Okay. We also have what they call rising externalization, or what we generally call in the US privatization. And so they define this as moving functions from government and service delivery outside the boundaries of government through contracting, vouchers for goods and services, and other stuff, right? And so, for a long time, some of this was already like these government functions were already privatized in a sense, right? Like the government wasn't building highways; they were contracting to build highways, right? And there are efficiencies in that set, right? Because you, as the government, right, or the taxpayer, arguably, you get sort of the economies of scale. When you buy big bulk concrete, you're going to get cuts in cost, etc. You're creating jobs, you're creating national security, like all kinds of different good things. But the idea of privatizing some of it is that there's a competition, right? Who can do it effectively and at the best price, right? Um, all of these sorts of things, and plus the like maybe the localized companies or whatever it might be might have more experience, expertise with the region, the climate, the supply markets, like all this kind of stuff, right? And so it can be a good thing, this tie between government and private markets, right? You just got to find a balance one way or another. Okay, and this became really popular. Like government building was very popular post. I mean, really during FDR, and then all the way up until like the 70s, or really LBJ was like the death of big government. Um, and the war on poverty, especially under LBJ, and a lot of like the racial politics and redistribution politics, and those are touchy. And we have, very different thoughts in this society about how we approach things like redistribution. Good God, it's supposed to be 20 miles an hour out there. We have very different thoughts about um, redistribution, about taxation policies, about um, the boundaries on who gets things like government handouts or government subsidies or whatever. And so, like the war on poverty, not only didn't really work under LBJ, but it also was just a disaster for trying to convince people that like government could be useful, right? And so, yeah, I think that's really where the turn went. And we got the stagflation from the 70s and OPEC crises and globalization's rising. And then Margaret Thatcher and Reagan hit the scene. And that's where we really take a turn toward neoliberalism, minimalizing US government and bureaucracy, and not just US, like globally, especially in the Western world, etc. All right, moving on. Section 27.3, the transformation of intergovernmental relations. And so here we're going to have a fun little history section, right? And we'll just talk about the four um, paradigms of governments, especially sort of through the eyes of the U.S., right? But mostly the Western, quote unquote, European scene too, right? All right. So the first of four periods of transformation is where we start to truly develop the nation state. And there are arguments about where this starts. Most people start with like the Treaty of Westphalia. Um, but we're moving from feudalism toward a state, right? Like territorial integrity, I guess is what we would call it in the literature. Um, and so you have geographical integrity, territorial integrity. We're starting to define who has power over what, right? And so we get like the English Civil War, where there are battles between the monarchists and the parliamentarists, and religion gets thrown in the mix, and like all of this sort of stuff. Um, you get Hobbes writing that like the king has to be unto God, in the analogy of the state, and the citizens sort of bow to God, right? And then Rousseau says, well, wait, the state also has responsibilities to the citizen, and so we're starting to build democracy, right? You get the French Revolution, and then after the French Revolution and the American Revolution, you really start to see the state solidify, right? Um, and territorial integrity becomes um, just incredibly important, especially in the modern era, right? It's written into all the international laws, all these states' constitutions, etc. You start to right. You also get a singular jurisprudence under this turn from feudalism or whatever medieval European stuff, right? And so not only do you get sort of territorial integrity, but you get a very defined jurisprudence where only the state is involved, right? There are no fiefdoms, right? Your nobility no longer means that you get to rule or judge those living in your lands. No more religious courts, right? And this is a big argument to this day with like the Middle East and other places like that. Um, and so the state now has full jurisprudence, whatever that might look like in these comparative justice systems, right? And then you get really tight boundaries of governmental organizations, and usually sort of the bureaucracies or these proto bureaucracies during the time are not very professionalized. They're usually filled through like machine politics and connections, um, and they're evolving very much, right? Like if you compare, I don't know, early Secretary of Defense or what we call, I guess now again we call it the Department of War, right? If you compare like I don't know 1820s or I mean shit even like under Roosevelt who Teddy Roosevelt who expanded the Navy incredibly, these bureaus look very different, right? And so it doesn't look much like it looked back then. Okay. We move to the progressive period, and it's nice that I sort of touched on Teddy Roosevelt because that's about the period we're talking about. So we're moving out of the Gilded Age. There's rising frustration. We see booming economies because of railroads and education is rising, and also the Industrial Revolution, right? And these are causing serious issues, especially for like the average citizen, right? There are real difficulties with exploitation of labor. There are still slavery-like practices in the scene in some places. There are real problems with like labor safety. and cleanliness, especially in places like slaughterhouses, and even like putting, I don't know, sawdust in the food, like sausages that they're selling, and this. And so this is the area where we really get trust busting. We start to build rules around labor safety and practices. We start to like think about at least the first minimum wages, and some of these cases are going to actually the court systems, and we're establishing rules around these things. And so, yeah, we're really evolving the bureaucratic system at this point. And let's see. This is also the point where we see the turn toward meritocracy in the bureaucracy, right? That rhymes weirdly, but this is where we get like the Pendleton Civil Service Act, the Hatch Act, and all of these were sort of defining, rather than having the machine politics or just your donors and influencers and the vote gatherers being the ones that you put in charge of government organizations. Now we have rules, tests, all of these sorts of things, and even like whistleblower protections and stuff like that, so that on theory we get a more merit based and expertise based bureaucracy, rather than the machine politics of old, right? Um, we're also seeing big movements in the economy, right? The Gilded Age, all the way up through the Great Depression, is characterized by periodicity, right? Like there are wild swings in the stock markets. There are wild swings in the value of currencies. Um, the markets are bubbling and then popping and bursting. And there are food lines. There are issues where, when that happens, factories will suddenly just shut down and fire everyone and go home. And so these are causing real problems, right? And so this is when John Maynard Keynes really hits the scene, and is spreading some of his ideas about demand economy rather than supply economy, which is what FDR started to implement after the market crash, the Dust Bowls, all of these sorts of problems. And so we're seeing greater bureaucratic and government involvement in the economic side as well now, right? They're not just printing currency, and adjudicating theft cases or fraud or whatever. They are now managing the economy, the broader macroeconomic economy, right? And so we see social welfare policies, which the bureaucratic entities have to expand to provide. We're seeing new demand side thoughts on economics when things are going wrong. We hit demand side when things are going right. We back off and hit supply side. We're seeing social safety nets hit the scene for the first time, like unemployment, um, and some sort of like proto workers' comp, and Social Security, etc. And then moving forward through the Great Depression to Eisenhower and beyond, we start to see massive investments in infrastructure across the United States, not by private entities like the Rockefellers or whatever, but now by the United States, right? By the United States government. And this includes dam projects, it includes the Army Corps of Engineer projects, it includes all of those sort of I can't remember the exact name, but the barriers around like New Orleans and other cities that are on coastlines, the water breaks or something like that. And so this not only got the government more involved, but it helped to build out jobs and get money into people's hands when the Keynesians thought that this was the way that we go forward, instead of pushing money toward corporate interests, because just making more products isn't helping anything, right? Okay. Uh, we get a massive expansion in the military industrial set. Whether you consider that a bureaucratic entity is another question, as we talked about before. But we see like the interstate system being built out under Eisenhower. We see massive investments in our military under Truman and others. And we're also seeing a rising enforcement of taxes, right? So it wasn't really until the 1910s when the Supreme Court legalized or allowed federal taxation. Um, and so we're seeing a rising IRS power. And I would say be careful about hating the IRS because usually the power of the IRS is correlated with the power of the United States because it means that we have legitimate governance. It means that people feel patriotic in paying their taxes. It means that we have money coming in that we can sort of pay for programs with, right? Okay, enough about that era. That was the second era, the progressive to about LBJs. Um, okay, the third era, cracks really start to spread, right? And this runs from maybe the 1960s to the 1980s. It's a pretty short period. And then we get this backlash movement toward neoliberalism, right? And so, and the banking insurance industries and sort of the stock market and like all of that stuff starts to really rise. We didn't have nearly that kind of focus pre 1980s ish, right? But the stock market has somehow become the indicator of U.S. economic health, and it's not a good indicator, right? From everything that we know, there are far better indicators of how well the average citizen in the United States is doing than the stock market breaking boundaries, right? And so from this period, the government is just taking on too much, right? We're trying to solve every damn problem in the world. It wasn't just, there was FDR came out this shining light, right? Like his approach works. Let's just lean into that as much as we can. But it led to really some bloat. And it led the US government and many governments in Europe and elsewhere to get involved in stuff that they maybe shouldn't have been involved in, or didn't know what the hell they were doing, or were remarkably optimistic about their likelihood of actually succeeding. And so, like, as you start to take on more and more that you can't be good at, um, the criticisms start to rise, right? And so we're seeing mass criticisms. We're also seeing mass changes around the world, right? We're moving sort of into the Cold War, like the real hot period of the Cold War. That's a weird way to say it, but yeah, we're we're moving into high Cold War era. Colonialism is collapsing planet wide, right? The Indians have freed themselves. Much of Africa is freeing themselves. And South America is roiling with tensions and guerrilla groups and military dictatorships. And like things are pretty hot during the 60s. And not only are they hot elsewhere, right? Because the colonized are calling out the hypocrisy of the Western movement. Um, and so is the US like racial division, right? They're also calling out sort of the hypocrisy of what things look like, the Jim Crow stuff, all of this kind of stuff. And so like the scene is getting fiery, right? There are assassinations, there are riots, there's all kinds of stuff going on. NGOs are also rising in power, right? Um, Analysts and people who are singularly focused on particular topics start to build their expertise and start to build organizations, right? And we would call this like social society or civil society or whatever, this Robert Putnam stuff, Bowling Alone and all this, right? But these are starting to build out, and they're sort of strong arming the government a little bit. Like we want some participation, right? And then market models really, really start to just dominate all the discussions at this point, right? And these usually come out of, for the most part, they're led by two schools, NYU and the Chicago School of Economics. Um, and so the Chicago School of Economics is where very many of the people who run our entire world, whose name you have never heard, they come from that place, right? And so this starts to really dominate the scene. Everything becomes about budgets, etc. And so we start to move into the Reagan Thatcher era. We're cutting back excess, right? Reagan gets really famous on like, government can't solve the problem, government is the problem, or some sense like that, right? And so we get mass cutbacks. We get a lot of privatization. We move toward neoliberalism and sort of wash out manufacturing in America, right? So that we can get the benefits of cheap goods from elsewhere under sort of comparative advantage theory. Um, but that has had some pretty terrible sort of overall effects. I can't get into all of that. That's another class. Okay. We move into globalization, the fourth and final stage, the stage that we're saying we're in right now. I actually think we're moving back away from that in a rebound. So, in my estimation, this lasts from about, I don't know, late 90s under the sort of internet boom to 2016-ish when sort of Trump hits the scene for the first time, and we start pushing back against globalization, networks, international organizations and rules, etc. Right? But during this sort of globalization period, which again is pretty short, you get this mass spread of new technology. You've got the mass spread of international institutions. And so no longer is it just like the UN floating out there or the IMF or the World Bank, right? We all know the big three. But when we start talking about like the international spread of rules, you get all these tiny little UN committees. You also start to get some sort of competing institutions out of places like China and elsewhere, like the Asian Interdevelopment Bank and others. Um, but these little international organizations are far more powerful than people understand, especially when it comes to technical rules, right? And so how does internet broadband work? What are the privacy rules around it? What are the safety rules around it? What materials do you have to use? What are the sort of background connections to servers look like, and the rules about crossing global boundaries or state boundaries and data and all of this stuff, right? What are the rules about 5G and then 6G and then 7G and G? That's a lot of G's. What are all of these rules as America just exits all these institutions? It creates power vacuums, right? And others fill these institutions, which invariably will set the rules that the United States will have to follow, right? And so, especially in these really highly technical realms like banking, communications, internet and data transfer, research sharing, all of this stuff, right? We also get the growth of not now only NGOs, but now international NGOs, international corporate structures, all of this stuff, right? And sort of the NGOs see it as like we're all citizens of one planet or whatever it might be. We have all a focus on a singular thing. Many corporations sometimes see it as sort of cultural spread and spread of their business, of course, but sometimes also tax avoidance, right? And so we know a lot of these giant American corporations have since registered in places like Ireland or Switzerland or Panama, uh, all of these places, the Virgin Islands, whatever, to sort of avoid taxation from the United States government, which is troubling, right? And then finally, we get mass cultural spread. And so cultural spread used to look like major countries pushing propaganda, art displays, famous musicians, ballets from Russia, right? All of these things across the world to show our sort of cultural dominance, right? But today it works very much in all directions, right? And if you look at something like the rise of K-pop, it's not just America and Russia sort of putting stuff on the scene, right? It's whatever is really cool out there and can pop on social media. Somehow that's now global, right? It's not just like McDonald's and KFC dressed as Santa. Uh, Colonel Sanders dressed as Santa in Japan, which is a which is a very popular thing, right? Um, but now this sort of cultural spread is happening in all directions, and it's pretty fascinating. All right, enough of the history of bureaucracy, right? Okay, we're in section 27.4, the network construct. So, what is a network in this sort of implementation talk, right? They say a network involves a cluster or complex of organizations connected to each other by resource dependencies, right? And this means, on the flip side of that coin, that when they don't have resource dependencies with each other, they are not considered networking, attached in a network way under this sort of theoretical construct, right? And then finally, they define it. They say, we use the term network to refer to structures involving multiple nodes, which they say are agencies and organizations with multiple linkages, ordinarily working on cross-boundary collaborative activities, right? So pretty easy to conceptualize, but we always have to sort of make sure we understand what we're saying. Many times in social science, which is not as merely a big problem in hard sciences. Some of my colleagues would be mad calling them hard and ours soft, but yeah, we're the soft sciences. Okay. Um, I forgot where I'm going with this. Jeez. um, yeah, I don't remember. Oh, yeah, definitions, right? The problem in social science and soft sciences sometimes is that we all use the same word, but we use it in very, very wildly different ways, right? Um, Depending on maybe the academic strand you're in or the substrand within your own field, or even people like researchers arguing past each other because they're not even like conceptualizing this word the same. So yeah, I mean this happens all the time, right? So it's important to define. I always do a definition in like every chapter, right? All right. Section 27.5, networks and their work. So, um, we've covered almost all of this before. I'm going to just sort of let you read through that section. Okay. 27.7, network formation. I think this is important. The implementation connection, right? And so, again, we touch on advocacy coalition theory, right? Individuals and groups and small NGOs or whatever it might be, um, they they see an advantage, some advantages in aggregating their efforts, right? And these could be resource advantages, it could be connections to donor networks that you might need, it could be information sharing, it could be signaling that like there are more people looking at this than you think. I don't know. There are a lot of different reasons why we might sort of build a coalition, right? But it isn't always that sort of rosy um, or I don't know. I shouldn't even say rosy. It isn't always that, right? It isn't always we're all just coming together to try to fix a problem. Sometimes it's mandated, right? A governor or a president or a congressional body or whatever it might be, a parliament will say, like, we are by law setting a focus group or a discussion board or a rotating annual or biannual or whatever it might be evaluation process or whatever. And so, in this sense, like some of these networks were built purposefully, right? It's not just sort of willy nilly, we're all agglomerating until we build enough gravity that things sort of revolve around us. Um, that was fun. Uh, it's you have to do this, right? And sometimes it can be really good to take your network that's outside of those mandated, and you're just sort of yelling from the shade to inside of them, and now you have a seat at the table, right? So that can be really important. Okay, section 27.8. Uh, how do we activate a network, right? You need four real things. You need technical expertise, you need legal knowledge and lobbying knowledge. This would sort of touch on the chapter above. You need a budgeting department, right? Or sort of financial feasibility studies, stuff like that. And then you probably need messaging, which they call political. So this would be presentation to policymakers, citizens, constituents, stakeholders, other organizations, whatever it might be. All right. Section 27.9. No, that's easy. Oh, and then I'm skipping the rest, but section 27.10, learning and network management, I would just say, like, this is everything we talked about in the epistemic communities chapter, right? So if you're interested in learning more, go back and sort of dig through there. All right, that is the third of the 4 for this unit. So I'll get the last one up here in a second. Have a great day.